is the world's first passenger railway station. It's not exuberant or extravagant, because the railway companies weren't sure if gentlefolk would take to rail travel. After all, railways had been for this and this. So, how did a smelly industrial steam-hauled wagonway end up carrying the rich and famous?
In the early 1800s, Britain was building its first steam-hauled railways, and it wasn't long before people wanted to ride on the trains.
Early railways were concerned with the carriage of bulk goods, minerals, black gold, coal on the tramways of the northeast. So when it came to carrying passengers, there wasn't any precedent. So they used existing technology for their carriages or coaches. Looks familiar, doesn't it? And that's why that's what they're called. This is a stagecoach, complete with a brakeman on top, sat facing forward, the luggage behind him on the roof, the passengers inside swathed in rugs. And all this was perched on top of a four-wheel coal truck.
And it really was as simple as that. A wooden superstructure bolted on to a rigid truck. 2 axles, 4 leaf springs, brakes worked by the brakeman. So, in an accident, the flimsy wooden superstructure would just break away from this undercarriage with disastrous consequences. Even though travelling on the early trains was a risky business, more and more people wanted to experience steam power.
But if you couldn't afford a first-class carriage on rails, you had to make do with this. It's an open goods truck with benches, and you were lucky to get benches. Some companies divided their open goods trucks between the carriage of people and cattle. But in 1841 there was a terrible accident. At Sonning, 8 men died in a collision. Men were thrown bodily from these carriages. It was carnage. An Act of Parliament was passed that stipulated conditions for the carriage of passengers. It had to be roofed, properly seated, and there had to be trains every day, calling at every station with a minimum speed.
With a growing public appetite for this sometimes deadly speed, train mania started to sweep across Britain. But for some, the idea of this fast track travel was terrifying.
Thomas Creevey, an MP and opponent of rail travel, said, "The quickest motion to me is frightful. It is really flying. And it is impossible to divest yourself of the notion of instant death upon the least accident happening."
For most, the idea of being able to travel further, quicker, was very enticing and opened up a whole new world. In 1836, it took 18 hours to get from London to Manchester. In 1852, by rail, you could do it in 5. People wanted to travel by train.
322 million in 1870, 797 million in 1890. And the Brits, more than others, loved it. In the 1880s, the railway passenger journeys in Great Britain were more than the rest of Europe combined.
And it wasn't just about going somewhere fast. Trains opened up new possibilities to people. Before railways, life had been lived on a very local scale. But suddenly, there were new opportunities. Country folk could visit the expanding cities. The city dwellers could get to the seaside. And there was another major impact. Time. With horses and carts, nobody ran to a timetable. And when it was noon in Plymouth, that was when the sun was overhead. And when it was noon in Wick, the sun was overhead there. But that didn't work for railways. They have to have timetables. So you had to have standardised time. It had to be the same time in Plymouth as it was in Wick. And if you didn't keep your eye on the railway clock or carry a watch yourself, you'd miss the train.
Of course, when you start carrying passengers, especially at high speed, safety considerations become paramount. You can't treat people like cabbages, although the early railway companies tried to do that. So, companies developed a series of stringent safety checks. One of the most famous safety checks
that was conducted before every train departed, and it was very evocative to anybody who travelled on the railways up until it was stopped, was wheel tapping, like this. Because in the days before ultrasound and X-ray checking, tapping the wheels and listening for a change of note that would tell you whether it was fractured or not was the only way to make sure that your wheels were sound.
Trains stoked the fire of curiosity in Victorian Britain. Exploring nature in admiration of God's work took the richer Victorians out of the cities and into the wilderness.
A day in Blackpool's nice, a day in Brighton's lovely, a day in the lakes also very lovely. But if you want real scenery, real spectacular Victorian grandeur, why not come to Switzerland?
The Victorians wanted to climb new heights and see the world. They wanted to get to the top of the mountain, but wanted to get there in as much comfort as possible. After all, they had standards and corsets to consider. They would pay to see spectacular scenery. The challenge was on for anyone to work out how to get a train up a very steep mountain.
Shouldn't there be a little man coming out telling you whether it's going to rain or not?
Built in 1892, the Brienz-Rothorn Railway in Switzerland was the steepest, highest railway ever constructed. The Swiss had come up with a design which would carry you to over 2,000 metres in just 40 minutes. A technological marvel, especially considering the engineering problems that had to be overcome. The main problem was with smooth wheels on smooth rails, the train will slip backwards. So the Swiss added a third rail, a cogged rail.
Cog systems have been tried right at the beginning of the railway age, by Blenkinsop, for example, at the Middleton Colliery, in an attempt to solve general problems of traction and adhesion. By the mid to late 19th century, they were being developed for mountain railways. At Mount Washington in 1868, and then in Switzerland. And Reichenbach designed the first system in 1870 because he wanted to get everyone into the mountains. Good lad.
Niklaus Reichenbach was a mountain railway pioneer who also had a good eye for employing talented engineers. His main assistant was Roman Abt, who came up with the perfect cog system for mountain railways.
Hello. If you'd like to come down here, I'll explain. This is the Abt rack and pinion system. It's a double system. There's only one rack here because we're in the engine shed, but on the mountain there's two, set slightly offset. Similarly, the pinions here are offset, so it walks itself up. There's never not anything engaged. Plus, these are also sprung to take out any unevenness. Neat.
Abt had perfected the track, but the steep gradient presents another problem.
You'll notice something very strange about these locos. All their boilers are at an angle. Kneeling cows, the Swiss call them. There's a very simple technological reason for that. Because if you're ascending a gradient of 1 in 5, suddenly your boiler is level, which means the water stays level, doesn't expose the firebox, which means the locomotive doesn't explode.
It all makes sense when you see it in action. Reichenbach's little kneeling cows running on Roman Abt's rack and pinion rails were a winning combination, with over 11,000 Victorian sightseers taking the trip in its first season.
Okay, doesn't seem quite. It's a silly little engine now when you see what it has to do and how hard it has to work. It has to work so hard, in fact, that we're halfway up in the middle station, Plan Alp, and they have to put more water in.
After a bit of oiling as well.
It's thirsty work, chugging up a 1 in 5 gradient, and the small engines can't carry enough water to reach the top without a fill-up. To ensure the safe running of the lines on such a steep gradient, the railway builders came up with some ingenious engineering ideas.
The arrangement is that the engine is always downhill of the carriages and is not coupled. The buffer's just resting against that there. So ascending, the engine acts as a traction unit using the apt system, and descending, it acts as a brake, so that the steam, in this case a steam brake system, brakes the whole unit as it comes downhill. So the engine is always downhill of the carriages. So there's no need for coupling, gravity does the work. However, if there's a problem, this brake is applied here, winds on and just clamps this pinion wheel into these racks, and that will stop the whole thing dead.
By the end of the 19th century, there were trains in Europe that could reach some of the highest peaks. But rich Victorians didn't want to just ride up mountains. They wanted to steam across whole continents in carriages. By the end of the 19th century, there was a growing appetite for travel. The introduction of passengers onto the railways had been a huge success. And with the rapid expansion of the networks, people could travel further in less time than ever before. At first, the carriages they rode in were basic and functional, but not for long.
That's what I call paintwork. Every ounce of the railway company's expertise in their carriage making, in their rolling stock, their engines, their drivers, their signalling, their standards of service went into these, the royal trains, the carriage of the head of state. A silver bedstead. Queen Victoria started the trend in 1842, but she was scared of rail travel and stipulated that when she wished to move from one part of the train to another, or even from one chair to another, the train must come to a complete stop, and she had a communication with her driver. This carriage was built for her son, who had no such problems. The faster the better for Edward. He made his own stipulations, though. He did not want any communication from carriage to carriage. Edward valued his privacy very, very much.
Although royalty was doing it in style, trains for the oi polloi were still very basic. There were, however, entrepreneurs ready to offer better surroundings for those that could pay.
In the 1880s, a Belgian who rejoiced in the name of George Nagelmakers wanted to bring real luxury train travel to Europe. His plans had taken off after a visit to the United States.
Supposedly, it was a trip to mend a broken heart that took George Nagelmakers to the USA in 1869. But while he was there, he met the man whose name epitomizes extravagant trains.
George Pullman was one of the first creators of luxury travel. His carriages were comfortable, robust, and he went to town on the interiors. Good morning.
Pullman had started building his revolutionary coaches for the expanding American Railroad in 1864. When George Nagelmakers came to visit, Pullman invited him to travel on one of his early coaches and even discussed with him the intricacies of the design.
There was lots that Nagelmaker admired about Pullman's sleeping cars, and lots that he didn't. This is the layout that the Pullman car developed, and it looks like every single film you've ever seen set, funnily enough, in a Pullman sleeping car. It's a very open layout, and it changes from a daytime layout to a nighttime layout, where these beds fold down. The beds are made up with extra mattresses, and you're separated by curtains. And that was Nagelmaker's problem, because apart from the men's, gentlemen's washroom there, and the ladies' washroom there. The rest of it was mixed. Oh no. No, absolutely not.
In Europe, one could not have gentlemen subjected to the temptation of ladies' ankles. Pullman would have been far less eager to discuss the details if he had known he was talking to the man who was to become his greatest rival in exotic train travel.
Nagelmacher's return to Europe, and inspired by American service, engineering and go-gettery, created the most luxurious long-distance passenger train in the world. Voila! The Orient Express.
The first Orient Express journey set out from Paris to the east in 1883. Nagelmachers knew his main customers, the European aristocracy, were obviously class-obsessed and would require much more privacy than their North American counterparts. So he created sleeping carriages with compartment doors that could be locked.
Welcome aboard of Voiture Lit, sleeping car number 3425. Rather beautifully decorated with Art Nouveau marquetry by René Proux. It was actually made in Birmingham in 1929 in Smethwick by the Birmingham Railway and Carriage Company. Now, this sleeping car has seen some action. It was used by King Carol of Romania for various affairs, and then in 1940, when he fled his country, it was one of the carriages that made up the train packed with all his art and treasures, and it was shot at as it crossed the border. So it has seen action, enemy action. The Rhine.
The impressive 16-carriage-long train is staffed by 6 French chefs.
About to cross the border into Liechtenstein, most of which I own.
12 stewards,
Merci.
10 waiters,
Thank you.
3 barmen, and a piano player, I beg your pardon, pianist, who look after the 180 pampered passengers. The Orient Express was designed to be a luxury hotel on wheels, the like of which Europeans had never seen before.
This is a day compartment. It's not very spacious, but it is very opulent. It's a bit like a ship's cabin. Everything its place and a place for everything.
Nagelmachers made sure the interior design was beautifully engineered to provide the maximum comfort in a confined space. For the personal touch, cabin attendants were assigned to each carriage, always ready to assist, day or night. The comfort of the ride wasn't purely due to the luxury and attention to detail provided inside the carriages. The high quality of engineering started with the carriage construction itself.
Coil and leaf springs. Belt and braces.
To create a smooth ride for his first-class customers, Nagelmachers used the same technology as the Americans used, as Pullman has utilised. Bogies. So instead of having a 38-foot coach with 3 sets of wheels on a rigid frame, these coaches were 70 foot long and had 2 sets of bogies either end. So that meant they could be sprung that way and that way, and gave a very, very smooth ride.
So we have a beautiful train, beautifully built, beautifully run, full of beautiful people eating beautiful food, beautifully waited upon. But I think the real genius, Nagelmacher's real genius, is in the long distance part of this luxury train. It's the logistics of getting this 16 coaches across all these borders. How did they do it? One of the things they did was that they used the local operators' trains. They never had their own locomotives, so that created revenue and employment for each area they passed through.
Nagelmacher's skillful organisation and attention to detail ensured a punctual service right from the start.
On the inaugural run from Paris to Constantinople, the train ran into a problem. One of the restaurant cars' axles started running hot. It had to be changed. And here's his brilliance. There was a spare restaurant car waiting in Munich. Yes, please.
Nagelmacher's standards of organisation and efficiency are still maintained today. With depots on hand, full of everything needed to keep the trains in immaculate condition.
You have the dining car chairs. There's 5 different types of those. These are the toilets. Then you've got spigots here. Heat exchangers new, heat exchangers old. Brass letters large. Boilers. Brass numbers small. Brakes, obviously. Tassels. Now, where are the light bulbs? Aldo! Where's the light bulbs?
By the early 1900s, there was an Orient Express every day, crossing the continent in luxury.
It was really the only way to travel long distance in Europe, so it got used inevitably for lots of underhand dealings. Everybody, all the countries it passed through, sent their spies to other countries that it passed through. Baden-Powell, who later founded the Scout movement, was a British spy. His cover was that he was collecting moths, and he came back with lots of very intricate drawings of moth markings, and none of which existed because they were coded drawings of military installations. And much later, a US naval attaché met his death after he was pushed through one of these doors.
Steam passenger trains had transformed the way people lived their lives. Only 40 years after the first passenger train, not only could you go to the next village and travel to the next city, but you could cross entire continents. What in 1829 had been an uncomfortable and dangerous method of travel had been transformed into the epitome of style and luxury. Lunch, anyone?
And the only reason I'm here, and the only reason I've got a beer, is because of that, can you hear? That industrious little engine. Ladies and gentlemen, the railways.